microblading artist here in Huntington Beach, California. My company is Microblading, and I specialize in natural microblading. This channel is for you to grab some of my tips and secrets so that you can get natural looking results for your clients as well. And today we're going to be going over my favorite technique for brow mapping. It's the string method with a little bit of a modification in it. So take notes, make sure you're ready, and let's get started. So I start the brow mapping with my client in a seated position. That way I can see how their brows naturally fall. And the first step is to find the very center of their face. The middle isn't always right in between the middle of their brows, but it's usually right in between the middle of their eyes, of where their eyes start, and then down through the center of their nose and up their forehead. If you have to erase this a couple times, then that's totally fine. Just make sure that you're keeping the string nice and tight, and you slide the string upwards to create a nice crisp line. Then I find the inside line that marks where their brows are going to start. Now this should be the same on both sides. It should be the same distance from that center line that we just created on each side. And a good rule of thumb is usually a little bit inward from where their eyes start, from their little tear ducts. Some people do it with based on where their nostril is, but sometimes for me that creates a brow that's a little bit too close together. You can also see some little baby hairs if they have sort of sparse brows, but you see the little baby hairs right there? That's usually a good indicator of where you could start your microblading, and it would blend right on in with those hairs. So I usually like to choose that for my starting point, as long as they're the same distance on each side. Next, I like to find the arch, the upward angle for their arch. So I'll take their favorite brow and I'll just kind of follow along the hairline. You can do it just a little bit up from where their hair is growing, but I think it's a good place to start, just to follow right along that hairline so you can fill in any gaps that they have. And I do the same thing right along the tail. This is where you can increase the arch a little bit. If you wanted to, you could make the brow kind of go out a little as opposed to down, but she already had good arches, so I just followed what she had here. And I'm just making them a little bit darker, that way I can see them without making it too dark or too sloppy. Now, the face is naturally curved, so it's important to keep your string nice and tight to prevent the string from sliding and to make sure that you're following through with those lines. It needs to cross the center line at all points. That way you can trace it on over to the other side. Here I'm finding where her brow ends, which goes from the nostril up to the corner of her eye and through that line that we just made. And here I'm marking where the arch peaks, and we're going to follow that on over to the other side, so it's important to just make a little line right there. So again, we found the center, we found the inside lines that are the same distance from the center, we found her arch on her favorite side, we found where they ended, and we found where the peak of her arch is. Now we're going to find the horizontal line that crosses through the two lines that we made, and that we're going to make sure it makes a 90-degree angle with those vertical lines so that it's the same on the other side. And this just makes sure that the brows are the same height. That way we don't end up with one eyebrow higher than the other. Now we're going to mark where the peak is. That's where the top of the arch is. Hold the string nice and tight because again the face is curved, so you want to kind of almost just pull it across while keeping it straight like that. Make sure that line is very parallel to the small little horizontal line that we just made below. You also want to make sure that you're following it through. It should go all the way across her forehead as a nice straight line. So here I've got my caliper, and I'm gonna measure the distance between the inside start of her eyebrow and then that line that we made that marks the peak of her arch. That way we can measure over the same distance from one brow to the other. So we're gonna take that same distance, and I just make a little nick in that line to mark where it's gonna be on that side before I get my string and I trace it on over to that side. So it's almost like we're doing things in reverse for this side. I'm gonna mark where her the peak of her arch is right now, and then I'm gonna make the other lines that define the arch. So I make sure that it's crossing all 3 points in the center. The point where her brow begins, the point that is the tip of the arch, and then that inside point where the other line crosses the center line at the very bottom there. And if it's all lined up, it should easily cross all 3 of these lines, and then you know that it's the same as that side. We're doing the same thing for the tail, only there's 2 points on this side. So you're going to make sure that you keep the string nice and tight, and you're going to cross it in the center, cross it at the peak, and follow it through. Nice and straight. And here on this side, I'm going to find out where her tail ends, again from the nostril to the corner of her eye, and then up. So we've got a nice brow mapping here. I'm just going to double check everything to make sure that these lines are equal, and they are, so that's perfect. I've got some lines underneath the brow if you haven't noticed, but we're going to get to that in just a moment when she lays down. And I'm just making sure that all the lines are dark enough. You don't want it to be too dark because otherwise that can scare your client. It can look very wide and very intimidating to someone. So I like to keep the lines pretty light, but I need to make sure that they're all connected, and I like to make sure that they're dark enough for me to still see. Here we've got the underneath of the brow, and I'm just kind of feeling things out for what her under arch is going to be like. But I'm going to do the under arch with my client laying down. That way I can get a better angle on it. So here she is laying down. We've got everything nicely mapped out for the top of her brow, but we haven't done the bottom yet. And I'm just going to soften up the arch right there. Some clients do like it to be like a sharp kind of peak, but most clients like it to be just a little bit softer. So I soften up that line, and then I find where her brow is going to end on the bottom. And this line should also be very parallel to the other horizontal lines that we've made. Here I'm finding a nice angle for the underneath part of her brow, and I do this just to kind of start myself off, but I end up filling it in with my pencil because the bottom of the brow has a lot of curves to it. So if you're using your string for the whole thing, then it can be a little difficult to get nice crisp lines, and it can be kind of hard to make them even as well. So here I've started myself off with the string, and I'm following where her natural hair growth is. This client already had really good arches underneath, so I'm following for the most part where her hair's growing. But if your client has very sparse brows, then you can kind of project where that line would continue to go, just to make the brow shape complete. Here I'm doing the same thing on the other side. So I've started them both off at the same angle, and I'm just gonna fill in right there. She's missing a little bit more hair on this side, so there's a little bit of a gap between her hairline and the line that I'm going to be starting my microblading at. And I do just want to say real quick that this video isn't for anyone who has particularly like very asymmetrical brows. I will be putting out another video guiding you on brow mapping for someone who has a lot of asymmetry, but this is just for like a standard like basic brow mapping. And here I'm just softening that arch again. Notice my lines are still pretty light. Again, you don't want to scare your client with something too dark. Now I'm getting into a little bit of my pre-draw, and I'm going to draw on just like where the spine of the brow is. This is based off of how the hair is growing on each brow, but I do like to try to make them pretty symmetrical. So I'm marking the angle that the hairs are going to come down into her spine from the top, and I kind of mark it with a string just so that way I can get a similar angle on each side. So I'm marking where my spine is going to start, and then I am just drawing in the spine at a very similar angle to what the other side had, although it does depend on how the hair is growing on each brow. So if they're not exactly the same, that's fine. It's more important that they look good with each individual brow while you're working inside of it than the hair strokes being like at the exact same angle as each other, just so that way it blends in nicely with each brow individually. So you can see here I've got my pre-draw all set. It's got a couple like little strokes just directing me what angle I'm going to be coming in for those front strokes, and I've got the other side, my front strokes, and then the tail strokes coming downward, and yeah. And everyone sort of has a different pre-draw, so I didn't go into like great depth about that, but I can make a video on that as well. This is the shape. She already approved it. I always have my clients sit back up, approve the shape, and then I get started with numbing. I use Numb 520, and it sits on for about 20 minutes. Make sure that you're not dipping the same tool back into the jar. So I always put an abundance of it on my glove that I dip into to put it on each brow, just for sanitary reasons. And then, yeah, so that just sits for 20 minutes. I do put a little bit of plastic wrap over it to keep it from drying out, and that is everything. I'm going to include some after photos of my clients' brows, that way so you guys can just see how they turned out. Here they are. And I want to thank you if you made it this far in the video. Be sure to comment, like, and subscribe, as I am a new channel here, if you want to see more tips for microblading.